Bon, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à la deuxième journée du sommet. Et je vais commencer par une petite présentation des prix de l'Association européenne de terminologie pour donner ensuite la parole, pour annoncer et donner la parole à notre gagnante. Donc, décernés tous les 2 ans par l'Association européenne de terminologie suite au verdict d'un jury international composé d'experts de renom, les prix internationaux de terminologie récompensent les meilleurs travaux effectués dans le domaine de la recherche terminologique au niveau du master et du doctorat. Les prix renouent avec la belle tradition des prix internationaux d'Infoterm, que l'AET a repris à son compte et rebaptisé Prix internationaux de terminologie, voilà 17 ans déjà, en octobre 2001. L'objectif assumé de cette belle initiative a toujours été d'encourager la recherche tant appliquée que fondamentale en terminologie, tout en étayant la reconnaissance de la terminologie en tant que science. Les noms des prix, à l'époque, repris par l'AET et maintenus jusqu'en février 2018, évoquaient précisément cette philosophie opposant recherche fondamentale, théorique, à recherche appliquée et développement. Le prix international pour performance exceptionnelle en recherche fondamentale théorique dans le domaine de la terminologie et le prix international pour recherche appliquée et développement en terminologie. L'enjeu était et reste de taille, surtout pour ce qui est du second volet, reconnaissance scientifique en tant que domaine du savoir. D'autant plus que la norme ISO 704 version 2009 revoit à la baisse précisément cet aspect-ci dans l'effort de démanteler la polysémie du nom terminologie en français. Donc, si en général, mais je cite la version française de la norme. Donc, si en français, une terminologie, deux terminologies, la terminologie 2 désigne des ensembles structurés de termes, c'est travail terminologique qui est recommandé par la dite norme comme désignation non pas de l'activité du terminologue, ainsi que son signifié compositionnel le laisserait prévoir, mais de la discipline elle-même. Les idées de cadre théorique de l'activité du terminologue, l'idée de réflexion théorique, certes pluridisciplinaire, encore présente dans la version 2000 de la norme ISO 704, disparaissent pour de bon de la version 2009. Dans ce contexte, les éditions 2010 à 2016 des prix internationaux de terminologie de l'Association européenne de terminologie auront exprimé une prise de position, y compris en faveur de la dimension théorique de notre domaine. Les intitulés des prix ont été profondément remaniés en février 2018 lors de la réunion du bureau à Barcelone. Les nouvelles réalités montrant qu'une intervention explicite en faveur de la reconnaissance disciplinaire de la terminologie à l'université serait la bienvenue. À une époque où les programmes de master en terminologie tout court versus master de traduction spécialisé avec des cours de terminologie se font rares et où la terminologie disparaît des intitulés, sinon des plans d'enseignement, des licences en traduction et interprétation, un peu partout, du moins dans l'Europe de l'Est. Les 2 prix internationaux de terminologie sont désormais le prix international pour performance exceptionnelle en recherche et développement dans le domaine de la terminologie niveau doctorat, et c'est bien spécifié le niveau cette fois-ci dans l'intitulé du prix, et respectivement le prix international du mérite en terminologie niveau master. L'idée revient à Anna Ostrowski, qui a pour la première fois, donc c'est elle qui est venue avec l'idée de exactement cette formulation. Les 3 candidats pour la première catégorie de cette année ont illustré au superlatif les 2 directions. Nous avons donc désormais une réflexion théorique et une réflexion et des applications aussi bien dans les thèses de doctorat que dans les thèses de master, ce qui est d'ailleurs une seconde raison du remaniement. Donc, puisque de fait, on retrouvait les 2 dimensions dans les deux types de prix alloués selon la formule précédente. Alors, comme je l'ai dit, la réflexion théorique se retrouve très bien représentée, ainsi d'ailleurs que l'aspect application et innovation pratique, dans toutes les 3 thèses présentées pour le prix du niveau doctorat. Les 3 candidats, à savoir Bécharat Fati de l'Université Pompeu Fabra de Barcelone avec Terminology Planning Evaluation, The Case of Persian Language. Richard Kamai de l'University of the Western Cape, South Africa, a multi-theoretical analysis of the dynamics and effects of terminology in Nigerian and South African high school textbook on life sciences, et respectivement Migration in Translation, the role of terminology and trans-editing in shaping the crisis in EU institutions, by Jessica Mariani at University of Verona. La compétition a été très serrée. Mais la gagnante désignée a été, comme vous le savez déjà depuis la lettre d'information, Jessica Mariani de l'Université de Vérone et directeur de recherche, le professeur Arnaldo Soldani. Gestionnaire terminologue certifié ACQA, Jessica Mariani est un langagier qui a déjà une expérience remarquable en journalisme et en communication politique, notamment au sein de l'unité de presse du Parlement européen, expérience dont elle a tiré profit dans sa thèse. La thèse offre une vue d'ensemble des évolutions de la terminologie des migrations au sein des institutions européennes depuis 1950 à 2016, à force d'extrapoler les choix terminologiques et les équivalents interlinguaux proposés dans la traduction des textes internationaux, textes juridiques et communiqués de presse. Bon. Pour passer au deuxième prix, malheureusement, cette année, nous n'avons eu qu'une seule candidature pour le prix destiné pour une fois explicitement aux mémoires de master. Et suite à de longues délibérations, le jury a décidé de ne pas accorder ce prix. Donc, le prix a été déclaré nul. Une mention très honorable, et cela dit, accordée à Paolo Michele Maria Panena pour son mémoire « The New European Legislation Regulating Market Abuse », a terminographic study in Italian, English, French and Spanish, la nouvelle législation européenne en matière de manipulation des marchés. Nous espérons retrouver Paolo parmi nos candidats au prix de niveau doctorat ces prochaines années, pourquoi pas. Bon, maintenant, pour ne pas vous ennuyer davantage, je vais seulement remercier à nouveau mes prestigieuses collègues dans ce jury, dont j'avoue être toute confuse d'avoir eu à assumer la présidence. Giorgetta Ciobanu de l'Université Polytechnique de Timișoara, Roumanie, Rute Costa de l'Università de Nova de Lisboa, au Portugal, Marietta Humar de l'Institut de la langue slovaque en Slovénie, Corina Lascucilianu, Académie d'études économiques de Bucarest, Roumanie, Nina Pilke, Université de Vasa en Finlande, Maria Popova, Institut de la langue bulgare, Académie bulgare des sciences en Bulgarie, Frida Sters de Louvain en Belgique, et Maria Teresa Zanola de Aciterme, secrétaire générale de Realitaire, oui, en Italie. Je veux remercier tout particulièrement Anna Ostrovski de l'Institut de langue et de linguistique croate, qui a été vice-présidente du jury et qui avait déjà l'expérience du jury 2016, qui m'a soutenue et conseillé tout le long du trajet, depuis la rédaction de l'appel, en passant par les propositions de modification du règlement, et jusqu'à l'étape des évaluations, avec un doigté et une gentillesse hors pair, qui la caractérise d'ailleurs en général, pas seulement pour cette activité. Je veux remercier les autres collègues du bureau de l'association, en particulier Henrik, dont les suggestions lors de la refonte des règlements ont été essentielles. Il nous a envoyé pas mal de versions avec les modifications et ses suggestions. Je veux remercier Sandra Quadrado qui s'est chargée, sourire aux lèvres ou emoji en bas de courriel, mais d'un bras de fer, de toutes les questions administratives pour l'organisation des prix et qui a merveilleusement géré la communication avec les candidats. Il me revient maintenant la très agréable tâche de féliciter au nom du jury et du bureau de la EAFT notre jeune gagnante, Jessica Mariani.
Oh, merci beaucoup.
De l'association. Et de lui remettre, donc de lui donner la parole. Donc, en tout cas,
merci
bravo,
beaucoup.
Jessica.
Merci.
Bon, alors tu vas, si tu as un présentiel.
Oui,
je
pense. Okay. So, good morning, everybody, and thank you really from the deepest level of my heart for conferring me this recognition today. Thanks to the European Association for Europe for organizing this and for this great initiative, and to the jury for choosing my research project. The name of the research project is Migration in Translation, the role of terminology and trans-editing in shaping the crisis in EU institutions. I would like to say that I'm not the only winner of this research project because there are many people involved in it. And I will briefly introduce the whole project to all of you in a nutshell, very, very briefly. So the project lasts 4 years, so from November 2014 until January 2018, and it is part of the Doctor Europeus program. It involves many disciplines. So it does not only involve terminology, where I had the honor to work with Professor Lynn Bowker from the University of Ottawa, who supervised me, and the Terminology Coordination Unit of the European Parliament in Luxembourg, pioneered by Rodolfo Maslias and represented today by Violina, who spoke yesterday at the summit. But of course, what I tried to do with this project was to combine terminology with other disciplines, and I combined it with news translation, for example, and I was supervised by Professor Luc van der Slaer from KU Leuven. I used ethnography as a methodology where I was supervised by Kaisa Koskinen, University of Tampere, and Corpus Linguistics, where my supervisor at the University of Verona, Professor Facchinetti, did a great job with me. The project has been run together, as I said, with the European Parliament and precisely with 2 units. Not only the Terminology Coordination Unit in Luxembourg, but also the Press Unit in Brussels. So, first of all, why did I choose migration as a domain? So, as you know, the migration crisis is at the forefront of media attention. We hear about it every single day. The crisis, and some of you might agree with this, some of you might think that it's not a crisis in the end because we have always moved, we have always migrated. But it broke out in 2015 with the Arab Spring. And the debate over migration involves a policy of classifications on several levels, so on an institutional, media, and general level. Translation, and so to say terminology in it, is crucially implied because it is recognized as the language of Europe. Without translation, without terminology equivalence, we couldn't communicate in Europe nowadays. So, as I said, people have always moved around the world. Migration has always been a factor in world's history. But although the concept of migration is as ancient as human beings are, we still encounter difficulties in finding the right terms to describe this concept and everything that relates to it. So basically, who is a migrant nowadays? Am I a migrant, for example, moving from Italy to Belgium to work? They don't define me as migrant because I am an expat. So this is, the main idea I started from, with this project. The research questions I tried to answer were the following. So what impact have terminology and translation had in shaping the migration crisis in EU institutions? And how does the European Parliament structure its communication process through terminology and translation? So I will go through the aims, so very practically. The first aim was to provide an overview of how migration terminology has evolved from 1950 until 2016 in EU institutions. By EU institutions, I mean Parliament, Commission, and the Council of the European Union. The second aim was to explore term choice and its translation in institutional text, so legal text and press releases. And for this, I used Corpus Linguistics as a methodology. In the other part, I used ethnography. I will tell you more about it in a while. And the first aim was to investigate how terms are coined and coordinated. I investigated the role of the trans-editor in EU institutions, so people who don't only communicate, but they communicate in their text through translation without being necessarily professional translators. And then discover the role played by translation in the communication process. So, as you can see from this graph, it was a multi-level research. So where you had basically 2 methodologies and 2 units collaborating with me. So what does combining corpus linguistics and ethnography means? It means combining the study of text with the study of the people who use a translation and who use terminology, to find possible correlations between translation products and processes. So what did I do? The first step was to collect all terms related to the term migrant in official EU glossaries, and they are the EMN, the European Migration Network glossaries. I obtained 54 terms related to migrants in EU institutions, and for every term, I investigated the birth and life cycle, the patterns of use, the degree of equivalence in Italian, and the trends. The second step was to investigate terms in all types of legal documents contained in the Corpus Eurlex English 2 2016, contained in Sketch Engine, which is the software I used, and the time range is 1950-2016. Sketch Engine was chosen by the whole committee because it's very user-friendly, and then it already contained the corpus, so it was, of course, easier. Third step, I compiled myself a corpus of press releases of the European Parliament, where I worked before the PhD. This time, the time range was 2010-2016. Why? Because some texts are not available before 2010, so I really couldn't do the same I did for the legal text. The last step was to investigate term equivalence, English-Italian, through the parallel corpora function in Sketch Engine. So I could see which equivalents in Italian were used. So after collecting all the data, I will just skip it and go here. So I divided my ethnographic work into 3 phases based on Blommaert and Dong work. So in the prior to fieldwork phase, I did what I have just explained. So I collected the data. After going through the data, I brought all the data with me to the 2 units of the Parliament and stepped into the second stage, so the during fieldwork phase. I spent a lot of time in both units, so also traveling back and forth from Italy to Brussels and Luxembourg. And then after spending my time with them, I collected all the data here. So I analyzed who deals with terminology in EU institutions. It's not only terminologists and translators, but there are many other people who don't necessarily have the same background who take decisions upon it. The methodologies I used were various methodologies, so fieldwork, observation practices where I took notes, interviews, I organized also focus groups and roundtables with them. So this is the model, for example, I used for the ethnographic work. So as you can see, the data, the terminological data are in the center, and all around it, I analyzed the translation agents, so who are the actors, what they think about translation. So this was especially interesting when I worked with communicators using terminology and translating. Then the translation practices and the translation management, if there is a policy about translation within the unit. I then obtained a lot of data, which are all available if you are curious and would like to know more. The thesis is open access on the University of Verona website and on my page. So I basically created a new little glossary where you can see all the terms, the most recent definition, the occurrences and time range in Eurlex, and the EAFT identification number. The most important part, I would say, is the parallelism I drew between the terms I obtained and the historical background. So as you can see, for example, in the colorful graph, in the colorful scheme, there are a lot of terms coined since 1990. Why? Because in that period, so between 1990 and 2012, we had new trends in migration towards and within Europe. So of course, you can track history through terminology. This is what the message I would like to convey today. This is another table of results, so to say, that I wanted to show you today, the relationship between every term I analyzed, so hypernyms, hyponyms, synonyms, and then of course it depends on how the concepts in a way evolved, over time. I will maybe wait because you're taking photos of the slide. So, okay. This presentation, by the way, will be available on the Terminology Coordination Unit website in a week, 10 days, together with a summary of the whole results.
And on our summit page, I hope as well.
Of course, there will be everything. Then, this slide, for example, represents all the actors I identified who, use terminology and take decisions over terminology in the parliament. So there are not only terminologists and translators or the Terminology Coordination Unit, but as far as I could see, as far as I could detect from all the interviews, MEPs and legislators do take decisions over terminology without necessarily respecting, the guidelines or having a look at EAFT, for example. And then the lawyer-linguist is like an interesting role, which I think needs to be more investigated, because I thought that they were real linguists, and I found out that they are lawyers in the end. So in a way, I'm still a bit confused about who take decisions, but I can assure you that all the good work done by the terminologist and done by TermCord somehow risks to get lost when information filters through the communication DG of the Parliament, because they are not aware of what terminology is. So overall, just to give you some results, so between 1990 and 2012, a considerable number of new terms were coined in institutional text. This made the representation of migrants more fragmented and organized into different categories, which is right in a way, so that we can distinguish between migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. And on the one hand, this contributed on overcoming a simplified representation of migrants, but on the other hand, this fragmentation caused further fuzziness and confusion, affecting migrants as well. So, for example, just to give you an idea, the term migrant appears in EU documents only in 1980. Before, the only concept existing was the concept of migrant worker, so people migrating only for working reasons, not for other reasons. The term refugee went through a determinologization process, so from a specialized meaning, so the legal status of refugee, to a more general one. So now, in many texts, people refer to refugees as people who haven't necessarily got the status. So it's a way to, it has a political nuance in a way. Towards the 21st century, migrant use as an umbrella term was decreased in usage, and asylum seeker took over only in 1990s. I found many cases of mistranslations in legislative text, especially with the equivalent of refugee. The right equivalent for refugee in Italian is rifugiato, the only one, the legal status of refugee. But it was translated many times as profugo. Profugo is, in Italian, somebody who hasn't necessarily obtained the status. So it was a bit surprising for me to find this in legislative text. And then another example is cittadino non comunitario, so corresponding to non-EU citizen. The right equivalent now for non-EU citizen in Italian is cittadino di paese terzo. Cittadino non comunitario is indicated in EAFT as a deprecated term, which is still now used. Why is it deprecated? Because the European community ceased to exist after the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009, but it's still used. So then, concerning the ethnographic results, and I'm getting to my conclusions, So translation and consequently terminology is a communication strategy, has become a communication strategy in EU institutions, because this way they reach more people on a national level. And the status of translation is rapidly evolving in EU institutions. Translation beliefs and practices are very subjective. So translation and terminology are not the same things for people working in the same unit. And I refer in this case to the communication unit where I conducted a study. Translation and terminology played a big role in the humanization of migrants and refugees. So for example, in the last 20 years, no, maybe less, 15 years, I noticed that instead of using migrants, they used migrant women, children migrating. So there was an attempt by the parliament to humanize the discourse around migration. The evolution of migration concept caused terminological discrepancies as well. So my conclusion is that EU institutions needed to employ more terminologists, but also train communicators to translate and to use terminology and to be aware that terminology is something, specific. So just to conclude, debating over terminology is not only a question of political and institutional correctness, but it has real implications for migrants themselves, and this has to be taken into consideration. And as entrepreneur Warren Buffett said, bad terminology is the enemy of good thinking. And let me say that if we have to remind people that migrants are human beings, I think we have a problem. Thank you very much.
Je vais remercier à nouveau notre candidate pour l'excellente présentation et je crois qu'on aura une petite pause. Oui, pour commencer. Oui, s'il y a des questions, oui, en effet. Are there any questions or comments?
You are here to answer them as well.
Of course, of course, of course. And if you want to get in contact, these are my, okay.
Thank you, and congratulations once again. I just wanted to make a comment that there is a distinction in Croatian language about two terms. Maybe your example from Italian reminded me of this, but you said that the difference in two terms in Italian is whether the refugees have claimed the status or not. In Croatian, we had
obtained, yes.
Obtained.
Yeah.
We had two terms for refugees, basically translating into English as refugee. But the distinction was made during the war about whether the people were evicted from a city, from a sieged city, or fled themselves. Their status was the same, but the only difference is, well, at least it's not an official difference. These two words came to be separated, to be semantically different among people, whether they fled themselves or the city was sieged and then they were forced to evacuate by the enemy forces. Or, so I thought that might be the same case in Italian, but it's not so.
No, not necessarily, but it's interesting to find out in other languages that there are many distinctions, and these distinctions might have to be clarified. Because I can assure you, nowadays, when I speak to people working daily in EU institutions, they always have the same problem. They don't know how to define, and they really could just ask the terminologist to clarify this, and they try to find the answers among themselves. So I just find that this is strange and confusing. So that's why I think the work on terminology must be reinforced. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering whether you have any proposal of how to bring the terminology to the press agents, to the communications people. We have experiences in that the local press agents in South Tyrol is supposed to work bilingual in German and Italian, asked us for terminology training.
Okay.
But the conflict there was, we need simple terms. People will not understand this. We cannot use this because it's too complicated. And we had big difficulties in finding, a common point. We say, okay, use this, explain it. You cannot use that. It's another concept. So there was a big sort of issue there, and we couldn't find a solution. So maybe you have some proposals.
Yeah, I can just tell you what happened to me with the press unit. So just to give you a practical example. So I was a journalist myself, so I still am, but I just abandoned the profession. And then I trained as a terminologist because I became naturally passionate about it. So I brought this to the press unit where I had worked before qualifying as an ECQA terminology manager. And sometimes you have to be a bit mean in a way. Because we went through the text, some of the text, and I had the clear questions, and I'm aware of the strategies you have to implement when you communicate. But let me say that sometimes they call strategies what, in a way, is a mistake. They are not strategies, so you have to tell them, sorry, but it's a mistake. The example I would like to bring is the difference between trafficking and smuggling, which in Italian is traffico and tratta. And of course, you can hear that the sound is very similar. So we went through the text and I said, but here you are implying in this text that smuggling and trafficking are the same thing. And then they said, but is it not the same thing? And I said, no, that's why you have to go practically. If you don't know, quickly go to EAFT, because, I mean, it's a great tool you can use within the European Parliament. Just go to EAFT and be sure, that's it. Because then otherwise, human rights activists, of course, they want to take your text as an example, because, of course, you're breaking the rules. So sometimes I think it's just, they call strategies what it's not a strategy. Because people around, and also scholars, researchers, want good journalism, they want good communication, they want precise communication. And then the second example, and then I'll stop, is I said, why don't you refer to all types of migrants in all texts? Oh yes, but we have space constraints. I said, it's just 3 words. So just take out that and put migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, and they did it. And in the thesis, there is this example. So sometimes you just have to push it. And my proposal would be, of course, to, well, this is a bigger idea. I spoke with Rodolfo at that time. Just merge DG Translation with DG Communication, create more collaborations, and then train. There are so many trainings communicators go through, and they can also go through 3 hours in a month of terminology, distinguishing between terms and words, reflecting about concepts and so on. I think it would be very useful because for me it was extremely important to do. Thanks.
Yes, I got the micro. Congratulations.
Thanks.
I was very pleased to hear your presentation as well. I'm Susanna. I come from a Center of Textile Research at the University of Copenhagen, and we have at the moment a project about integrating refugee women in the textile and design field in Denmark. And I was very touched by this approach about making it more human terms around these concepts. I think we really need to open up to this approach about doing co-creation with these people that we receive in our countries, and to make the most of all the approaches we can get to all our industry and fields and design and creativity. And that is really a first step to make it, to make the terminology more human. So thank you for this, and once again, congratulations. We can take a talk around our project if you're available during the day.
And please, if you have concrete ideas or proposals, just go ahead, because I'm open. This is just the first step, so really.
Thank you, I'll take a look into it.
Thank you.
Okay, I think there is a last question.
Congratulations again, and thank you for an extremely interesting presentation.
Did you gather any data in your project about how these migrant people refer to themselves? What terms do they use to self-identify?
Yeah. Of course, I always expect this question, and I got this question before. As I said in previous times when they asked me this question, it would be extremely important and extremely interesting to involve migrants themselves, to ask them, how would you like to be referred to? And of course, in the other cases, the answer is, we are people, and we have to remind in the text that they are people. And this is already being done, I have to say, in the European Parliament. But to advance research, it would be, I agree with you, extremely interesting to involve them and also ask them what their experience is. So I'm completely with you on this. So again, if you have any ideas, just go ahead. Thanks.
Well, I'm going to thank you, all the participants who asked questions and made comments, because this is all about communication also, yes, the presentation of a prize. Congratulations again.
Thank you again. Thanks.
Thanks, and